The Mutual Broadcasting System presents STRAT, Strategic Risk Assessment Talk with retired Marine Intelligence Officer Lieutenant Colonel Hal Kempfer. Now, here's Hal.
This STRAT, Strategic Risk Assessment Talk, it's going to be something kind of getting behind some of the headlines, if you will. I'm going to address what regime change in Iran could look like, what some of the players are. There's been a lot of stuff in the news, although it's very difficult for anyone to figure out, well, if Khomeini is gone, who takes over? And I'm going to kind of get into that, what it might look like, what some of the players are, what they're saying, and potentially what the implications are to the U.S., to Israel, to the West, and, of course, to the region as well. First off, we've been hearing a lot about how the situation in Iran, the economic depravity, the collapse of the Iranian economy, the massive protests on the streets, all these things has put the regime in the most precarious or unsettled situation it's seen since the, quote, revolution, unquote, of 1979. There's a lot of discussion about potential regime change, and so I feel like I really kind of got to get into this. Now, though there's a widely stated problem that you hear in the news a lot, I have said it on the air many times, that no one knows what the regime would change into. What would it become? If you look at the protest movement, there haven't been clearly identifiable leaders. There's a good reason for that. With the draconian security forces, if you are an identifiable protest leader, your days on this planet are very much numbered. So many of those who appeared to be in a leadership position were either taken out, so to speak, or captured and being held in prison. Long story short, in the protest movement, even though I will say there does appear to be a lot of coordination behind the scenes, there doesn't appear to be those figureheads, if you will, those leadership figures that you would expect to pop out. And I think that is a reflection of the extreme authoritarian security regime, if you will, that's befallen that entire country. On 29 January of this year, the former Iranian Prime Minister, Mir Hossein Mousavi, this goes back quite a few years, who's been under house arrest since 2009, he issued a statement calling on the current officials of the Islamic Republic, that's interesting they use that terminology, to step down from power. So his language is they need to step down, that this thing has gone too far, that they've lost legitimacy, that they need to step down. He described the widespread repression of the recent protests as a, quote, major crime, unquote, and a, quote, black page, unquote, in Iran's history. And that's, within that context, it's pretty strong terminology to hear things like that. And he called about a political change to a comprehensive constitutional referendum without any external interference. And that is a lovely sentiment that will probably not happen anytime real soon until this regime is basically destroyed. I just don't see them ever coming together. I certainly don't see the regime or Khomeini or anyone, certainly not the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, agreeing to the idea of, hey, let's hold a constitutional referendum. That's just simply not going to happen. But he did propose this constitutional referendum, and it is an interesting concept in and of itself. Maybe that is a path forward. I don't think it's a path forward with the regime in its current situation, but it is an interesting path forward for whoever comes next to potentially embrace the concept of a constitutional referendum as the big next step, and that this would be a broad national front encompassing all political currents based on three principles. No foreign intervention. That makes sense. I mean, they want to protect their sovereignty. Rejection of internal authoritarianism. That's a rejection of everything the current regime stands for. And a peaceful democratic transition. And that is an aspiration. All of those are wonderful things that we could get behind. Certainly Europe, the U.S., Israel could all basically embrace that concept. So in that regard, it makes a lot of sense. Will it happen? I am a little skeptical. It sounds very nice. It sounds like a great idea, but that is one possibility. That is one thing that's out there. Probability, That's a different concept, but possibility, that's one thing that's out there. Now, Western research institutions have been observing from late December through January a series of statements by Iranian reformist figures, such as Foreign Minister Ali Rabai. He's a sociologist. Taqi Azad Armaki, researcher Armi Dabari Mer, and a noted academic, Abbas Abdi, all calling for an exit from the crisis. They have said that, look, Iran has hit the point of no return, that imminent collapse is coming upon them. There has to be a national dialogue, there have to be deep reforms to avert what they call a total breakdown, and emphasizing a rejection of violence and foreign intervention. Again, very aspirational, certainly something to look for as a path forward. Will it happen? I am deeply skeptical. Again, I don't see the steps necessary to get to that point. It's just simply stating something, and they didn't lay out a path for certainly the protesters to say, okay, well, this is how we need to get there. But it was something that they could look to in the future. Okay, on 11 January of 2026, the quote reformist front, which includes several reformist parties, called for the resignation of Iran's supreme leader, Khamenei, and the end of the current situation and paving for political transition. So you're starting to see some political movement. It isn't getting the press that a lot of other things are, but it is out there. That reformist front proposed a transitional council to govern the country and then prepare for structuring a new type of political system. And they talked about the option of the collective resignation of senior officials throughout the government, and for large scale popular demonstrations following what they call the peak of confrontation. So far, we have seen large scale protests, large scale demonstrations, and the Revolutionary Guard Corps and other more extreme, religious extremist elements, security elements of the regime simply went out there and gunned them down and killed them. So sometimes they need to think about some of the rhetoric that they're actually calling for. A rather notable position was recorded by a former Minister of Cultural Heritage and Tourism, Azala Zargami. He talked about, he was considered close at one time, certainly, and still kind of to the conservative camp. He said, it is not correct to attribute all losses solely to terrorists. That's interesting. And that may not seem like much, but here's somebody who was truly an insider, very close to the conservatives. That means the folks protecting the status quo. And he is taking a starkly different, in fact, one would say oppositional theme to the current regime narrative, that it's just a bunch of terrorists out there. In fact, that's not just the narrative. That's how they justify what they've done, killing not thousands, but tens of thousands of protesters. All right. Now, here's something that I think is something that really kind of jumps out. End of January 29th, the official newspaper, this is the official newspaper, at Teliad, called on President Pezeshkian, who's the president of Iran, to apologize to the public for the failure of the security services. In other words, they want the president to apologize for what the security services just did. Obviously, if he was to do that, that would be a clarion call to the security services that their position was being undermined and that they were under threat. So I just find it fascinating that the editors in charge of an official newspaper are putting something like that out, because that really is something out there. The newspaper openly questioned the reasons behind the free movement of armed elements despite extensive security deployment, and the justification for internet shutdowns, and arguing that these issues require convincing answers to the public. Didn't quite come out and call for a revolution, but obviously out there saying, look, there needs to be an explanation of why these things were done. All right. I'm not going to say that this newspaper or this media outlet is an example of a, quote, free press, unquote, but it is probably what makes this criticism even more notable, that it represents a very controlled press outlet, a very controlled media outlet, actually putting forward some some heretofore unexpected criticism of the regime. That kind of tells me that some of the pillars that are keeping the regime aloft are starting to really crumble very quickly. Now, Reza Pahlavi, who lives in the U.S., I think his last address in the U.S. was in Washington, D.C., maybe still there. He's the son of the last Shah of Iran. He has emerged as a prominent voice, a prominent figure among the protesters. There are many of the protesters on the street. I wouldn't say a majority by any means, but many of them had openly talked about supporting his potential leadership in a transitional government. I haven't heard anybody, and I'm sure there are some royalists out there that are saying, oh, we need to have a Shah back. But basically they're saying, look, and whatever comes out there, here's somebody who understands the situation, by virtue of being the son of the deposed Shah, has a certain amount of standing and could be pivotal in a transitional government. Now, there's a lot of debate amongst Iranians about who should lead the country if the regime falls, and particularly opinions are very divided about exiled figures maybe stepping in. You may recall that's an issue we had with Iraq. When we were in there, we were pushing an exiled figure, which was simply unacceptable to the Iraqi people, and that whole concept just fell apart. Now, despite the calls for change, experts are cautioning that a lot of this new regime talk is fraught with a lot of challenges because they have the Islamic Republic itself has, as I mentioned, with the Revolutionary Guard Corps and other elements, shall we say, a robust security apparatus. They have a lot of resources. It's very difficult for the protests to succeed without substantial defections from the military and police, and we just haven't seen those substantial defections yet. The current geopolitical climate, including international sanctions, regional tensions, the huge naval armada and other things are sitting off the shore of Iran. All these are influences that could support or hinder the movement for change. Military strikes by the U.S. and Israel, which is very likely to happen, could result in an outpouring of patriotic fervor. And that could be capitalized by the regime to coalesce support, in some ways overshadowing all the horrific things they did to the protesters, and use that fervor, that patriotic fervor, to strengthen their position, which would set back the protesters. And that's a big problem for U.S. and Israeli planners. If they use force, what do they hit? How do they hit it? What do they hit it with? What's going to be the message, the impression, the outcome of those strikes? And there's some things from military necessity they would have to hit. For example, they want to take out the retaliatory capability of the regime, the missiles and drones the regime would use to attack the region. And believe me, Khomeini and others have made it very clear that this would turn into a regional war. In other words, they would launch strikes against other Gulf states where U.S. military forces are stationed, and probably against states, and this is what Saudi Arabia is so nervous about, that where planes might overfly the territory. Iran has been saying that. Now, what they say and what they do are not always the same thing, but they have been saying that to make that threat very clear. Now, in late January, Ali Vaiz, who is the Iran project of the International Crisis Group, very noteworthy group out there on this, he said, look, this is not a stable status quo. It's just not tenable. And then he went on and said, look, I am not predicting the system will hit rock bottom tomorrow, but it's a spiral. And from this point on, it can only go down if it refuses to change. In other words, that's the system as it sits now. The status quo cannot stay in place. It has got to change. Otherwise, it's going to continue to spiral down. He's talked about transformation, and he says it's already started with the system. And this is not necessarily something we're thrilled about, but it's already started with the system moving from this clerical leadership into more military leadership, as the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, has been taking more concrete steps in controlling the government. And you got to remember, the IRGC, they part of them is the Al-Quds Force. That's the group that goes around the world, fomenting the axis of resistance forces everywhere. It was established after the 1979 revolution, and it is kind of considered the heart and soul, if you will, at least the paramilitary and military heart and soul of the current regime. All right. It has grown into the country's most powerful economic political actor as well. And there are all sorts of things. The IRGC is actually kind of like a big corporation. And that's why you see uh, the European Union and others trying to aim at the IRGC to basically undermine its ability to do business, to make money, which is what it does. I saw one thing that said the IRGC may control somewhere up to, and this may be a gross a gross overstatement, but they said somewhere between 20-25% of the Iranian economy may be controlled by IRGC. I've seen other estimates closer to 10%, but let's just say it is an unusual thing, not something you'd see in the West, that this paramilitary military force, this very religiously extreme military force, has such tremendous economic power in Iranian society. If the U.S. was to take out Khomeini, the supreme leader, which is one scenario certainly that's out there, the IRGC could try and seize power. That could be as bad or worse than the current situation. So that's something else that planners have to look at. And I would also take us back. Recall back in early January 2020, Qasem Soleimani, who was a Iranian major general, head of the Al-Quds force in the IRGC, he was killed by an American drone strike ordered by, then President Donald Trump. When he was in Iraq, he was killed right near the Baghdad International Airport while he was traveling to meet the Iraqi Prime Minister, Adil Abdul Mahdi. He was the commander of the Quds Force. That's one of the 5 branches of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. And it was, that IRGC has been designated as a terrorist group by the U.S., been designated as such by the European Parliament. So, yeah, bad actors, don't get me wrong. But he was very, very prominent in the region, and he also was considered the second most powerful person in Iran, next to the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei himself. So that gives you an idea of the IRGC and its standing in society. So basically, there's a real possibility that the heirs of Soleimani may suddenly end up taking charge in whatever this is. And that could be a very volatile mix with a very pointed hatred towards the U.S. and particularly towards President Donald Trump. Now, I would remind everyone about 20 to 21 million barrels of oil per day pass through the Strait of Hormuz. That's about 20 to 30% of the global oil trade. Such, IRGC has a fairly significant military presence in and around there. They got small boats, they've got missiles, they've got drones, all sorts of things that could really clog that up and cause a major interruption in the world's oil shipments. So there's a lot for the U.S. and Europe and other countries to consider, Asia to consider as well. And there are also, I should mention, I didn't state this, there's no doubt in my mind that covert elements of Israel's intelligence services, Mossad and their military intelligence service, and probably the U.S. I can't imagine that we wouldn't be telling our clandestine operations side to do anything other than working overtime to try and shape whatever this outcome is, because it's certainly in our national interest to make sure that whatever comes out isn't worse than what we have now. And we also saw, certainly with Israel's covert operations capability, how thoroughly they'd infiltrated Iranian society, and we saw that in the lead up and everything that surrounded the 12-day war last June. So anyway, long story short, regime change isn't always as clear as it sounds. Regime change never is quite as clear as it somewhat implies. And I would simply point to what many have also pointed, that there is, at this point, no clear leadership waiting in the wings that's going to step in and take over. There are a number of figures, some I've mentioned here, who are out there who could step in, who could be part of this. But, we've seen the largest protests ever. 30,000 plus protesters were brutally murdered by this regime. I don't think that horrific violence, even though the protests have largely been somewhat quelled for the time being, I don't think they have, quote, killed the protests, unquote. I think what it's done is it's metastasized this deep-set hatred in Iranian society for the regime and hollowed out what little remaining legitimacy the regime really had throughout Iranian society. So I think what they've done has really, I think it's much bigger, and it's much bigger than some of these former members of the regime are alluding to. I think that they are spiraling, and I don't know where that's going to go. I would also point out, too, that Iran is a big country. And when you go around Iran, you got one part of the country towards Pakistan, which has a large ethnic Baluchi element. You got Azeris up in the north. You've got Arabs, not Persians, but Arabs. As you get closer up to Iraq, you've got, in fact, all around the periphery, you'll see Kurds as well. You'll see all these ethnic groups with distinctive geographic holds, if you will, on the country that are being held in place by the current regime. But if that regime's hold lessens, you're already seeing some active rebellion taking place in certain areas. And I think that would that would increase significantly. And certainly the prospects for some form of civil war breaking out as this happens is something we can't ignore. And we certainly could see Iran starting to break apart as a country as we know it. And I would, if you have doubts in that, I would look to what happened to the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union fell, all those little republics, not all of them, but a lot of those little republics became actual republics. They became separate countries, and Russia was very different after the Soviet Union fell. And I think that's something that we should be looking at as a distinct possibility with Iran, even though they're not structured quite the same way as the Soviet Union was. All right, that's a lot of information. Hey, thank you for listening to STRAT. You can always go to stratpodcast.com. You can always go to Hal Kempfer TV on YouTube, and that's my channel. And then you can always go to my corporate website at www.gripsa, that's Global Risk Intelligence and Planning, gripsa.com. Thanks for listening, and I hope you listen to the next one.
STRAT, Strategic Risk Assessment Talk with Hal Kempfer, is presented by the Mutual Broadcasting System and is always accessible at stratpodcast.com, as well as most leading podcast portals, including Apple, Spotify, and YouTube. For more of Hal Kempfer's current events media appearances, please visit halkempfertv.com. Be sure to like and subscribe to STRAT at your favorite podcast provider.